A fellow lives across the street from me. By road facility for.
He had a commitment. I had coffee with him yesterday.
I was just curious.
Well, everybody who's here is, everybody who's going to be here is here.
Okay.
Somebody appointed by a court to look after his affairs, conservatory.
All right.
Financial thing.
Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for April 12th, 2023. Will the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young,
Here?
Carroll,
Here.
Fosdick, absent. Marl,
Here.
Gearbaugh. Here. Cole is absent. Beardsley,
Here.
Heft. Troika.
Here.
Staff present tonight are City Planner Auerbach, Community Development Director Harrington, and Recording Secretary Katnick. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda as distributed?
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes of March 22nd as amended or submitted?
So, second.
As submitted, correct? Yeah. Okay, no problem. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. I see no public comments present. On to the public hearings. 22-22. Application from Paul Schick of Pulte Homes, Michigan for a PUD final site plan for Phase 2 of Bella Terrace and the rezone from R1A to PUD to develop 13.3 acres and construct 63 single-family homes at 6675 Maple Road, Saline, Michigan, 48176. Parcel numbers 18-12-30-358-054 to 082 and 18-12-30-358-125 to 158. We have a report dated December 9th, 2022 from City Planner Auerbach, a report dated December 12th, 2022 from OHM Advisors, a memo dated January 4th, 2023 from City Engineer Humphreys, and a memo dated April 5th, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington.
Good evening. So as you mentioned, it's action item 22-22. It's a final PUD site plan rezone for Pulte Homes. It is the second phase of the Bella Terrace development. So Bella Terrace is located on the north end of the city. It's on Phase 2 specifically is on the east side of Maple Avenue and directly adjacent to Phase 1. This development will back up on its eastern end to MMI Engineered Solutions, forgive the typo there. And it was last zoned agricultural per Pittsfield zoning designation of it, but the PUD is built around the R1A standards. It will be rezoned to a PUD based off the R1A standards. So the request is a final PUD and rezone. This is our first time doing this together since I've been here, so the Planning Commission recommends approval or denial of a formalized site development plan based on zoning requirements, general appearance, engineering reviews, specific concepts that fit within the community, and more. It's far more broad than the typical site plan review. If it's approved, the applicant must make changes based on the conditions that the Planning Commission or City Council set for the site, as well as modifications in the event of conflicts with other entities such as Eagle, the county for soil erosion, the building department, MDOT if applicable, not in this case. If any proposed changes after an approval is found to be major, the applicant will be required to amend both the preliminary and final PUD with the City Council's approval. Currently, the property has already begun construction on Phase 1. It was previously undeveloped. I believe it was agricultural farmland prior to being developed for residential purposes. So you'll probably recognize this slide from doing site plans with me, but the Planning Commission shall review the preliminary and final PUD, in this case the final, and recommend approval or denial to the City Council with or without conditions based on the purposes, objectives, and requirements of the City of Saline ordinances and standard specifications. Just going through the first four, the PUD has additional considerations on top of our typical site plan reviews of residential density, utility location, grading, and then phasing of the development, as well as exterior architectural drawings noting building materials, height, and area of buildings and accessory structures, and then the traditional ones of area, width, height, and setbacks, natural resources potentially impacted, building location, site arrangement, parking and loading, site access and circulation, safety paths, landscaping, lighting, signs, floor plan and elevation, and then generally engineering considerations such as stormwaters, utilities, et cetera. So these are the preliminary PUD standards that we previously approved as a body. So the lot area going from the R1A requirement to the PUD requirement. So going from 11,700 feet to 6,600 square foot lots, area lot width going from 90 to 60, a smaller additional for corner lots, and then the setbacks have all also been reduced. However, lot coverage, the height, and then no longer necessarily applicable due to our code being changed. The stories are all remaining the same in compliance with our code. Although these standards line up probably better with the R1C district, which is a higher density single-family district, it was the city's policy for a long time to bring in new annexed lands as R1A. We have since removed that policy prior to my arrival, so in the future I think PUDs will likely be more based off of the zoning district that best matches their needs. So as far as the staff review for the final PUD in this particular case went, the only two staff points of concern or just identification were the exterior architectural drawings noting building materials, height, area, building, et cetera. The Phase 2 site plan included a lot more masonry being used on the homes themselves. The Phase 3 renderings of the homes include far less masonry and far more siding on the fronts of the homes, with only a little bit of the masonry being used in the building's belt. I'll show examples on the next slide. And then additionally, the applicant had a reduction in the total number of streetlights. Talking to the applicant earlier today, it sounds like they've communicated with DTE and will be able to provide further clarification during their time for comment. Importantly, you have to decide whether these are minor amendments or major amendments to the PUD, because that has an implication of whether or not they have to amend the preliminary site plan. I also have a list because I'm sure most of us don't know what constitutes a major PUD amendment off the top of our heads, so I'll show you that as well. So these were the renderings. It's a scanned image, so I apologize for the quality. I don't have a natural digital version of this. So as you can see, this is what was preliminarily approved. I'm sorry, it's a little washed. Like I said, I know it's not a great scan. But all these homes essentially feature a lot more masonry on the front, more brick and more stone, with less siding primarily being used on the sides, except for the bottom row, which had more siding on the front. These are their new proposals. You can see there's far less masonry. Some is used on the second row above the garage, but it's primarily switched to more of a siding-based development. It's very much an aesthetic thing. I don't believe there's any concerns over the building quality or construction, although the applicant can absolutely speak to that. Just a minor modification from what was originally proposed to the Planning Commission. And then another point of consideration for both this and Phase 3 is what constitutes a major amendment to a site plan, to the point where the applicant would have to go back and amend their preliminary PUD. So the criteria outlined in our ordinance is if it's a change in the concept of the development, if it's fundamentally switching from something other than single family, if it was a change in use or character of the development, a change in the type of dwelling unit, which I would understand or interpret to mean going from single family to multifamily as opposed to potentially just changing the facade of the home. Change in the number of dwelling units and density. It's a residential property, so the floor area requirement doesn't apply to them. Change in lot coverage or floor area ratio of the entire PUD. Change in the character or function of any street. Change in land area set aside for common space, or change in building height. So it's the staff recommendation that both of these amendments, both the streetlights and the facades, constitute minor amendments, and therefore the applicant should not need to go back through the preliminary process for this. There are a lot of conditions attached to this specific phase, as I'm sure you've seen in your packets. There are 16 in total. Most of these are just OHM's comments asking for more information. This is stuff that we'll use in our GIS systems when it comes to mapping utilities, stuff that is just administratively adds clarity to our processes, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything, which is why OHM has asked and recommended approval for this specific site. So I'm not going to read all 16 conditions on this one because that would be rather lengthy. But essentially, kind of the typical stuff that it has to begin within a year per our ordinance. They have to pull the right permits for this project. They have to provide an updated site plan with the photometric plan, which I believe they've already been in contact with DTE about. And then there's the list of things from OHM that essentially go over the engineering list requirements that they would like to see on the site plan for informational purposes for the city, both now and in the future going forward. And then lastly, any outstanding concerns identified by the engineer, any outstanding concerns identified by the attorney, and that pretty much wraps it up. So I'll take any questions you might have.
So I know it's in here and I read it, but what is the change in the number of streetlights?
It's going from 9 to 6.
Okay, and did you indicate the DT has been consulted on that?
Yeah, I believe the applicant can speak to that specifically.
Okay.
Just a couple. When you mentioned the issue with the streetlights, as I mentioned before, the different lighting that's on those homes, or significant lightings up in the soffits, is that a part of this reasoning in those homes, or is that not an issue? Because I'm concerned with the models that have those lights that shine on everything. And is this going to be a plan for all the new homes to be built like that?
I think the photometric plan would only have to show the illumination that the streetlights provide. I would expect there are, or in other words, that wouldn't necessarily be a factor in the site plan. I don't know if there's standards or for lighting review for dwellings.
Yeah, we do have glare and lighting ordinance restrictions. That will come up when we review the sign code as well, but there are specific glare and lighting restrictions. So if they are inordinately bright, or if they do project beyond the property lines to a certain foot candle amount, then we could potentially look at a code enforcement to reduce the lumens of said lights.
The reason why I'm asking is it seems like that's in a couple of 3 or 4 houses, but if that occurs in all the homes, and now we're reducing the number of streetlights, which is which? It's like, we're going to even overpower all the homes with lighting or whatever, but that may be an issue that's separate. My other question, have we resolved everything with Phase 1, including the connection to the road in the Lodi Township or Pittsfield Township?
So the road was an adventure in and of itself, but yes, we believe that we'd reached resolution with Pulte, Washtenaw County, and the DPW department essentially, and how to resolve the road connection outside to the subdivision directly to the north.
So all issues and concerns that have been identified by our city engineer related to Phase 1 have been addressed and resolved?
Or they're actively being worked on in conjunction as the development continues to be built. But yes, that Pulte has been a good partner so far in Phase 1.
And are there any issues where you feel that any of those items may be a stickler that we should address as part of the conditions?
Not at this time, no.
That's it. I have other questions on Phase 3. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just want to follow up on the material changes. I'm not sure I quite understand. When people buy a house, that they get to select their elevations and what have you, so we don't control down to each individual house how it's going to look. Is the idea that we approved a certain set of elevations from which in buyers can choose, and now they're changing that set, or how did this come into the purview of our original preliminary approval?
Right, so Mr. Auerbach can probably speak on it as well. Usually developers provide the general types of materials that the houses are going to be built out of. So in this case, it was more masonry heavy. So that the noticeable switch in materials, if the homes had changed aesthetically slightly on the front for how the facade is presented, we probably wouldn't have mentioned it, but because the fundamental material being used to build the house has changed is why we brought it to your attention. But we believe, once again, that it's a rather minor amendment, all things considered.
Okay, thank you.
The only thing I would add on that point is the focus of the review here is whether or not the final submittal is consistent with the originally approved PUD. Unlike site plans, the PUD also included elevations that it's not specific material requirements, but shows a general home topology of the products that the development will be providing. And so as long as the commission is satisfied that the material change is of a comparable quality, then it would be acceptable in our assessment. But like Mr. Harrington mentioned, major amendments are generally more significant changes involving the functionality or use of the site, which doesn't seem to be the case here.
Is there a motion on the table to acknowledge receipt?
Chair,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know there was mention about having put fencing in around the detention basin?
There was,
Somewhere I was talking about they were requesting it to be done.
I don't recall that item, but I believe typically it's covered in engineering standards or building code that detention basins that exceed a certain slope and or depth are required to be fenced.
It's item number 7 under the conditions. It's a 3-on-1 slope.
It might have been an OHM.
It was an OHM comment.
Yep.
Is there any way to not have to put that fencing in? Because I'm considering the one that was done at Maple Oaks and how that, and it's hideous looking.
I believe it's actually a safety standard, similar to get like fence a pool off, essentially. I don't know if it's something that we have any leeway on.
Can it be graded differently though?
It would be,
I think that would have, storm water management implications that, I think that would be a question for the city engineer, of whether the grade change would affect its capacity and how it needs to perform for the site.
Do you have something you'd like to add? Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Ted Hirsch with Midwestern Consulting. We're the civil engineers for the project.
I just wanted to know if there was something quick you needed to add. We still have to acknowledge receipt, and then I'll bring you up in a couple minutes.
Okay, yeah, it was just
Okay.
in regard to that. So
Thank you.
some of those items were actually discussed with the city engineer. So it's, a review by OHM kind of recommendation, but then we had kind of coordinated on some of those items with Tesha and got clarification on those, and no fence required or recommended and anything like that. So I do have communication from her, not written, but we've had those conversations. So
Great.
If we have specific questions on any of that, I can answer.
Great.
If there's nothing further, Madam Chair, I'll move to acknowledge receipt.
I'll second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes.
Motion to open the public hearing, affording the public an opportunity to speak at 7:16.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes.
If no one wants to speak, I'll make a motion to close.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, comments, questions from the planning, did I miss?
No, you're good.
Go ahead.
This would be for the applicant, either Joe, Paul, or your consultant. And gentlemen, good evening. As it relates to Phase 2, I think the biggest issue that would impact a potential buyer's quality of life is the berm and vegetation that will buffer the rear of the development with MMI Engineered Solutions. And as you're likely aware, I was actually just on site at MMI meeting with the owner a couple weeks ago. That is a very active, robust manufacturing facility and a growing one. And the rear of the facility, where actually most of the manufacturing is done, is right at the property line. Can you talk a little bit about the type of vegetation, the berm, and obviously I hope we're investing in vegetation, trees and bushes that will eventually be mature in size and provide a nice buffer so that you don't necessarily realize how close you are to a manufacturing facility.
Yeah, so that was definitely the intent with the initial design, and all of that grading should have been part of the mass grading of Phase 1. Some of that, a lot of the topsoil that was removed from the site was used to make those berms. So yeah, the height and the density and type of vegetation had all of that intended for screening.
Very good. And so, my apologies, because I haven't been on site in quite some time. Is the berm already in place?
It is.
It is, okay.
Yep.
All right. Very good. That's all I had. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions?
This one, as I'm thinking of it, when I'm looking at water mains and things in there, this has appropriately been designed to make sure that it's looped so that we don't have dead ends or anything else that could be a concern?
I would have to consult the city engineer, or I guess the applicant would probably know. I believe it is looped.
Should be.
Yeah, so it does make a connection over to Woodland Drive.
And then everything loops within the development itself?
Correct. Yep. And just for clarification on one of the conditions in there, this, all phases of water main, sanitary sewer have been reviewed and permitted through Eagle or MDQ at the time.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, we want to make sure that our new developments are always looped because we're having significant problems with dead ends and making sure that water quality
Yep,
is maintained, so
absolutely.
appreciate making sure that.
Yeah, there was significant study done on both the sanitary and the water at the onset of the project, so.
Does anybody have additional questions or comments? I guess I have a comment. There are quite a few conditions that are part of this. Can you speak to any of the 16 conditions, also about the streetlights? I understand about the, the difference in siding and things like that, but, there were mid-block crossings that street lighting was eliminated from, the soffits that Mr. Gerbach had talked about. Just, is there anything that you can speak about with 16 conditions on
Yeah.
phase two?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just kind of go down the list and try to touch on them as necessary. So number one, all of the necessary permits and approvals. All of the road commission stuff, that was kind of taken care of with phase one. As I just mentioned, all of the MDEQ Eagle permits for wetland impacts and for the detention grading and Eagle permits for sanitary and water main, all of that has already been obtained for all three phases. And then obviously all of the construction permits will be procured as they go through. Construction within 1 year of approval, that's, no problem. So the photometric plan, the most recent phase 2 and 3 plans, as he'd mentioned, didn't have those mid-block streetlights. And with Carlisle Wortman's first review of those plans and making those comments, we did go back with DTE street lighting, and we're getting an updated photometric plan that adds those back in. So it won't just be the intersections. We will have those mid-block light poles as well. The road crown within a proposed travel lane, again, that's something that was part of the original design and coordinated with the city engineer and OHM at the time. That's the way phase one was constructed. It's a pretty typical design. And just noting that there's no, objection from OHM. It's just mentioned that the acceptability shall be discussed and resolved with the city engineer, which I think is a kind of commonality throughout some of these comments. So the next one about C-factor calculations. So trying not to get into the weeds too much, but when we design our storm sewer, we make certain assumptions about runoff coefficients for different types of surfaces. And with specific models of homes at each lot not being clearly identified, it's kind of on a selection basis. We don't know exactly how much impervious surface from each site is, being contributed. So we make some general assumptions in that regard. So when we have our spreadsheet, it lists those runoff coefficients. And if you were to get down to, really nitty-gritty design, you might see stuff like 0.68 and 0.53, but our calculations are more general of 0.6 and 0.65 and kind of rounder numbers. So that's where the comment came from, and the discussion with OHM kind of explained that, and they understood. So their comment being that if there was anything significant, that would change any of those assumptions in a material way, that would be kind of brought forth. The next one about the number of orifices in the 100-year elevation calculations. So that's another one we discussed with OHM, and I discussed with the city engineer and clarified that there was a slight, I think it was 9 orifices in the outlet control structure that was designed or it was provided, but only 9 were necessary. And it's a very insignificant kind of difference in the outlet rate, so that was something that the city engineer was okay with not changing, being that that's already constructed. Number 7, so this is the comment about the fence. So per county requirements, that grading, 1-on-3, that level of slope on side slopes for a basin, would anything steeper than 1-on-5 would technically require a fence. But because the city, although it does follow county standards to an extent, has its own kind of final say on that. At the time this was all designed, the city engineer had made that decision that it wouldn't need to be fenced based on the location, kind of depth and overall design of the basin. So again, that's something that was discussed with the current city engineer, and she was fine not requiring a fence around that. Applicant to ensure that the quantities listed on the cover sheet for the utilities. So yeah, there may have been some minor discrepancies in the quantities and public utilities listed on our cover sheet versus maybe what our profiles were listed, you know, maybe a rounding error or something like that here or there, just a really kind of technical drafting cleanup item. Labeling a sanitary structure. So to Mr. Harrington's point, just trying to get a lot of detailed information on the plan. So when these are used for things like GIS in the future, it's just all easy to find information. And it sounds like there was just one structure that was missing a label. Same thing with the rim elevations being stated on the grading plan. That's just kind of another technical item that'll be added. Ramp elevation, I believe this one was the proposed elevation. It was just a typo as far as where it was placed and how that calculated out for confirming ADA compliance, and that was something discussed with OHM as well that we'd clean up. The applicant shall submit construction plans showing plan and profile view of all public infrastructure. So that is something that was included with both phases 2 and 3 and reviewed by OHM, reviewed by Eagle. So I think that comment is just kind of already taken care of. Same thing with the next one, submitting for water main and sanitary permits for this and phase 3. All of those permits are in hand for all phases. Placing funds in escrow to complete construction plan review. So again, the construction plan review is essentially complete with all of that information already being included and reviewed by OHM. And then, but certainly the developer will work to coordinate and understand what that amount is and submit that escrow for the construction oversight and things of that nature. And then any outstanding concerns by city engineer or attorney, we haven't been notified of any outstanding concerns from either. Great.
Thank you very much.
If I could hop into, we're currently in the process of creating a construction review, that's part of our engineering review standards. So to Ted's point, a lot of this is rather redundant to things they've already done. And in the future, there would be more of a cadence to how these work, where we won't have to list all these specific conditions that they're likely working on simultaneously with the submittal, but rather, you know, they must receive construction plan approval from the city engineer. I think that's kind of the future of where we're headed with this. So I understand that, yes, there are a lot of conditions attached to this specific proposal. As Ted just identified, most of them are rather innocuous and are already been addressed. It's really just a matter of the city ensuring that the development will be completed to the same level that it would be had we had this process that we're currently in the process of creating set up in time for this review. So.
Right, and my question, obviously I've done reviews on this as well, but seeing 16 conditions is a little overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know we had talked about having most of them knocked off before we gave approval, but knowing that the engineer has addressed most, if not all, at this point is just, you know, peace of mind. So
yeah,
thank you both. Yes.
Again, going back to that number 7, my concern on that one, based on how that's written in here, it would almost appear to be a need or required for a variance to not have a fence. Because it's saying, should be around the perimeter, subject to the requirements of section 703 of the zoning ordinance.
So the section 703 is the standards for building a fence, so it would have to meet our fence standards of height and material, but no, so it wouldn't require a variance for that specific section, but you could always recommend that the city council not consider item 7, given the fact that I think that was the only one here that potentially would be contradictory to the city's current position on the fence. So we could recommend it with all conditions. Removing number 7, I think, would be appropriate.
Or my recommendation was to modify that slightly to say based upon the review and approval by the city.
But yes, absolutely, that would work as well.
Noting Mr. Gearbaugh's language for item 7, Madam Chair, I'd move to approve with conditions.
Is there a second? All right, so we modifying language on number 7. Is there any additional discussion? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes to approve with conditions. Item 22-23, application from Paul Schick of Pulte Homes of Michigan LLC for a PUD final site plan for Phase 3 of Bella Terrace and the rezone from R1A to PUD to develop 10.1 acres and construct 44 single-family homes at 6675 Maple Road, Saline, Michigan 48176, parcel numbers 18-12-30-358-001 to 044. We have a report dated March 28th, 2023 from City Planner Auerbach, report dated March 28th, 2023 from OHM Advisors, memo dated January 4th, 2023 from City Engineer Humphreys, and a memo dated April 5th, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington.
Perfect. So very similar. Action item 22-23, final PUD rezone Bella Terrace Phase 3. Unlike the other one, it is on the west side of Maple Avenue, still on the north end of the city. It is across the street from Phase 1. It will be adjacent to Pittsfield Township. I believe Lodi Township is actually further west, but I could be wrong in that specific boundary. And then it is the last zone agricultural per Pittsfield, but the PUD is built around the R1A standards again. Similar, it's still the final PUD and rezone request, so you're making the recommendation as you just did. The current property, as I mentioned earlier, construction has already begun on Phase 1, is previously undeveloped. Same standards for this phase as well in terms of what we're really looking at here. Same proposed PUD lot standards that were approved for all 3 phases. So really the only difference here comes right back to was the facade change, a major or minor change, and then importantly with this one, there's the addition of emergency access drive that was not previously part of the plan. This was more unfortunate. It was caught 4 years after the fact that the development as it was proposed violated the fire code essentially. So for homes for subdivisions with over 30 homes, there needs to be 2 different points of access. Our new fire chief identified this as a problem when we originally sent these out for reviews. Myself, Planner Auerbach, our engineers from OHM, Ms. Humphreys, the city manager, and I all sat down with Pulte to kind of brainstorm a solution with the fire chief on how we were going to achieve compliance but not completely curtail the entire development. And I think we were effective with the solution that we all came up with, and then Pulte was definitely effective in what they proposed in their plans. So the applicant was required per the fire code to add this emergency access drive. It was placed over an area that already had an existing easement that was not necessarily meant for common or open space. It served a practical utility purpose for the city already. And then as for why it was a chain and bollard as opposed to some other sort of block on that specific access drive, it was actually the preference of the fire chief, not a decision by the developer, to do a chain and bollard system, because in the event of an emergency, the chain and bollard system is actually much more effective for them to remove quickly and to respond to emergency. I understand it might not be the most aesthetically pleasing thing, but it was definitely the preference of the fire chief for public safety that it be a chain and bollard as opposed to a more official gate or fence or something to that equivalent. It is the staff's opinion that the Planning Commission view these both as minor PUD amendments, and we'll get into that in just one second. So here are the elevations again from last time compared to what they are now. And then here's where that location of the proposed access, emergency access drive is. So there'd be a chain and bollard as denoted on the site plan, signs that clearly state that it's not for parking, it's not for loitering, it's not for turning around, it is solely for emergency access. And then what constitutes a major change again? I think the ones that Mr. Auerbach and I considered for this were the change in the character or function of a street or the change in land area set aside for common space. As I mentioned earlier, the location of this emergency access drive is over what was already set aside to be an easement for utilities for the city. It wasn't really intended to be part of this larger common recreational space that you'd consider, so we don't think it really neatly fits that. It's actually not a change, and it's not really a street either. It's an emergency access drive, so we thought, once again, it definitely fits more the definition of a minor PUD amendment rather than a major one. So this one has 10 conditions as opposed to 16. Similarly, almost all of these are just informational things for our engineer and to make sure that we have all adequate information prior to, in the future, having a more robust construction review process to ensure that we achieve compliance on these things. But just to go through them quickly, again, all necessary permits should be pulled. Construction on this phase shall begin within 1 year of its approval per our ordinance, provided an updated site plan with the photometric plan, provide more details about the signs and chain bollard gate for the emergency access drive. Back to the C-factor calculations, the construction plans that have already been submitted, submitting the water and sanitary sewer permits to Engineering and Eagle, as applicants already indicated that they've completed, placing funds in escrow for the construction review, which has already been completed, and then engineer and attorney comments, which we've received none of at this time. So with that, we recommend that you recommend approval of the final PUD for Bella Terrace Phase 3 for Pulte Homes with the following conditions. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, please.
And you mentioned in your memo, can you talk more about the public walkway? What materials is that going to be made out of? Because this side of the road should be a continuation of the concrete sidewalk, not an asphalt pathway.
Is mine or planner Auerbach's?
It said to be, I think it was Auerbach's.
Let's say I don't think I commented on the public walkway.
Okay, and I believe those were Phase 1 improvements?
Well, they're part of Phase 1, but this is Phase 3. Why would that, there is no sidewalk on that side of the road.
On Maple?
Yeah, correct.
They had, I believe most of the Maple Road improvements, including the sidewalks and the bulk of the landscaping, were done with Phase 1. There was some additional landscaping added with Phase 3, but.
On the north side, yes. I mean, on the east side, I don't believe the sidewalk or anything's been put in on the north side. Or, I mean, on the west side. That's part of Phase 3.
Let's see.
Because there was a concern of that, how that was going to be cleared.
Yeah, on page 4, under 5 of his, Mr. Planner Auerbach's memo, comment was location of sidewalks are shown in Phase 3 plan. Phase 3 does not include any additional footpaths or walkways.
So we're going to allow development not to have sidewalks on, I don't want another Huntington Woods situation here.
The Phase 3 component includes 5-foot wide concrete sidewalks along Gretchen Lane. Sidewalks only provided on the north side of Gretchen Lane in the area adjacent to North Maple Road access drive, which will connect to the North Maple Road rectangular rapid flash beacon, our RFB crossing that was approved with Phase 1. So there will be sidewalks that move them across the street.
But not along Maple Road.
Not on that side of Maple Road.
Wood on the,
I would have to look at an area. I don't believe there are any sidewalks on that side of the street at the moment, so it would be a short sidewalk to nowhere compared to the path on the other side of the road.
they would connect to the crosswalk that's right there now. The east side pathway connects to a crosswalk that comes across to the west side to connect to Maplewood. So now there is no pathway on the west side connecting that Phase 3 to the city.
Phase 3 connects across the street to Maple, which connects to the city.
But you have to cut across the street, is what you're saying. I'm talking about.
You have to, you're right, but there's a specific crosswalk design, so it's not, you're not jaywalking. There is a crosswalk present on that side of the street.
Still means you have to cut across the 40-mile-an-hour street in order to get to a crosswalk on the east side, instead of being on the safety side up on the east side, on the west side. I'm just saying that this phase does not include a sidewalk on the west side, correct?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe it does, no, but
And I guess I'd like clarification from staff, why we would not want that after the Huntington Woods fiasco.
I guess I'm,
Your time, but I'm asking that question at this point in time. So, my recommendation on this is that we need to talk about a sidewalk on the west side to be consistent with
right.
all other developments in the community.
I guess to my understanding, there's not, where would the sidewalk go on the west side? Because I don't believe there's any existing sidewalk that would connect to where the development ends. But I can look at an aerial real quick for you.
That was the same that was the same issue with Huntington Woods, yet we went ahead and worked with the township. This is actually in the city, so we would have right away along the Maple Road to put in a sidewalk.
Yeah, so looking at a current aerial, there's no sidewalk that goes outside of the Wildwood subdivision along Maple. So the nearest sidewalk on the west side of the city dies at,
Should end at Maplewood.
yeah, Maplewood is where the sidewalk ends. So there would have to be an extension through another subdivision prior to reaching Phase 3 of Bella Terrace in order for that sidewalk to go somewhere, so to speak.
Right. But I would also recommend looking at the Huntington Woods, all of that aspect, and that's exactly this situation we're talking about right now. Thank you.
Additional questions or comments for staff? Is there a motion on the table to acknowledge the receipt of the four memos listed above?
I'll move to acknowledge receipt, Madam Chair.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Applicant, developer comments, limited to 10 minutes if you'd like to come up here and speak about Phase 3.
Yeah, I don't think there's really much else to say that hasn't been said. I don't know how early discussions went, but I imagine something like that in regard to a sidewalk on the west side of Maple. They did provide pretty extensive improvements on the east side with the pathway and a bridge over the county drain to make that connection. And then, as Mr. Harrington stated, there's a dedicated crosswalk connecting to Phase 3. So I think all of those are good points in that. Well, and I guess I'll say this, that wasn't the only crosswalk. There was an additional design crosswalk where on the east side, after the new pathway crosses to the south side of the drain, it does cross back over to the west side of Maple. So there's two different locations. You would have to cross Maple Road to get to the other side. But again, if there was going to be a significant connection, it would have to go off the actual project property to make the full connection and would require another bridge over the county drain. Other than that, yeah, I think it was the emergency access that was added on Phase 3 was, again, just kind of an easy change, something to rectify, something that was just kind of fell through the cracks and ended up being a good location for it, kind of meets all the requirements. And we had good discussions with city staff and to come to that solution, and we will provide some additional details on the bollards and chain as requested. But other than that, I think it's all pretty straightforward.
This first question might be for Paul or Joe. So as I'm looking at conditions for the motion to approve, condition 2 is that construction of Phase 3 will begin within a 1-year period. While I'm sure you'll technically be able to meet that requirement, can you talk a little bit about timeline moving forward? So obviously Phase 1 needs to be complete before you move to Phase 2, and then you jump across to the west side of Maple to begin Phase 3. And maybe, Joe, if you might, give us an update on how things are going at Phase 1.
Yeah, great. Joe Score, Pulte Homes of Michigan. Good evening. Yeah, I mean, so in terms of Phase 1, we had a little bit of a slow start outside of the pent-up demand that we had coming out of the ground. 2022 was a little bit of a tough time with interest rates rising and the housing market. So went a little slower than we'd like, but we're starting to get a little more traction over the last several months, so we're excited about that. In terms of phase 2 and 3, I mean, you said it's kind of a matter of absorptions. I mean, if things go as they're going, we would expect to develop phase 3 within a year. If things were to slow down, I mean, we might come back looking for an extension. Again, those are sort of extraordinary types of situations where we have market slowdowns. But as based on current absorption and pace that we're seeing in phase 1, we would expect to develop phase 3 within this next year.
Okay. So, and I'm not going to hold you to this.
Sure.
Obviously, very fluid process. Things go according to plan. Obviously, build out phase 1 and then move to phase 2 about this time next year.
We would develop phase 2. We would develop phase 2 this summer.
Okay.
With the intention to develop phase 3 next summer.
Okay. Oh, very good. Appreciate the clarity.
Yep.
Thank you, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
And your consultant may be able to address my other questions. So I want to comment on Mr. Gearbaugh's concerns about a sidewalk, because this is an issue that what he's citing has proven problematic in a number of specific instances over the years. And the argument that we're hearing, with all due respect, is, well, there's no connecting sidewalk in that vicinity. Well, if we had used that argument historically in this community, there'd be no sidewalks. And he cited a very specific, relevant example of a subdivision that actually Pulte helped to build out, Huntington Woods Phases 2 and 3, that when it was first conceived, our predecessors promised a connecting sidewalk and then failed to deliver for over essentially a 20-year period until we stepped in and the city took the lead on making that happen. So I guess, long story short, how difficult would it be to install a sidewalk on the east side of Bella Terrace Phase 3? Noting, of course, the comments you made about the existing sidewalks on the east side and the crosswalks. Those are more than sufficient. We as a body and as council and as staff talked extensively about that. Those are wonderful additions to the community. But I do think, at least theoretically, a sidewalk on the east side would be beneficial. West side, excuse me. And prevent a lot of hiccups and headaches 5, 10, 15 years from now.
I guess I would answer it this way, in that just along the frontage of where the actual development is occurring, it's probably not a terribly hard thing to do. I think it's the more difficult is when you get to the drain and try to cross the drain and actually get further south for that, connecting to the more extensive network.
I appreciate the perspective.
Yeah.
I know that came up at the last minute, so I appreciate your candor in responding on the fly.
Sure.
That's all I had, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Question on building envelopes, and I'm looking at that for both Phase 2 and 3. Probably a bigger issue for 2 than 3, but I'm reminded of Huntington Woods, where the houses were being placed on the envelope of a larger variety and leaving no room for decks. And we had a variance request, at least one, there could have been more. Doesn't seem to have been an issue in Phase 1, but is there any reason to be concerned about that in either phase, given the tightness of these envelopes?
I can actually comment on that for you. So the PUD standards themselves have specific provisions for how those accessory structures will work, which I think was a wise provision in that preliminary plan. So I'm, as a staff member, in terms of enforcing this, I think it should operate a lot more smoothly than the Huntington Woods development did, which was less of a restrictive PUD like this one. This one had a lot more restrictions, so I think it was thought for well in advance.
You happy with that answer? That work for you?
That works.
Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments for the applicant, developer?
Madam Chair, if there's no additional questions for the developer, I'd move to open the public hearing at 7:48, affording the public an opportunity to speak to this issue.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes.
If there's no member of the general public who wishes to speak, I'd move to close the public hearing.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Any additional comments, questions from the Planning Commission members? Yes.
My recommendation or suggestion is that there be a sidewalk installed on the west side of Maple
And going along with you, even if it's a stub and it doesn't cross the county drain, it's a lot shorter of a segment for the city to have to look at later rather than the entire length of the frontage of Bella Terrace Phase 3. So,
And one of my concerns is because the city ended up having to cough over almost $400,000. There was some contribution, but it became a more and more expensive project. At least it's in the city this time and not having to deal with the county. But we know that will happen. No one wants to cross the street if they can avoid it. And we've already had complaints about Maple Road, the new construction we're going to plan doing this year at where the library is in terms of crossing there and making sure the proper sidewalks and things are in there. So at this point in front of this phase, I think this needs to be part of this phase.
I'm amenable to that. I can go either way on making that a condition. I think that when this item or when this issue appears on a council agenda, it's really a policy question for council. Whether council wants to be consistent on the issue of sidewalks or whether they don't. So regardless of whether it's enumerated as a condition, it's an item that I will ensure is discussed and considered by city council when this is on a regular meeting agenda.
I would think it would be wise to bring Engineer Humphreys and Director Searles into that too, because I think the longer consideration is, does the city have the funds or the interest in extending the rest of that sidewalk down to, I forget the other name of the street you just said, Maplewood, because I think that would be a barrier to it if the city doesn't have the funds or the means. What would be the point in putting that burden on the developer when they've provided crossing on the other side of the road?
I mean, that's a concern because on the other side where the bridge is placed in, that was done as asphalt, not concrete, which puts another burden on the city as to maintenance of that. And then also the bridge, I don't know who has responsibility for the bridge, if that will be dedicated as a public resource, or will it be a responsibility of the homeowners association? And I don't think we ever got full answers on that.
So that should be included in the development agreement and/or master deed, which is, should be provided prior to final approval.
Question, would it be possible to require in the master deed the requirement or the permission that homeowners be assigned the responsibility of paying for a sidewalk should we ever deem a sidewalk to be necessary if we didn't require it here? It's sort of what happened in Northwood, I think, with the bridge there at Woodland. It was in one of the documents, and I believe the homeowners paid for it, not the Peters.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Obviously, we want to engage legal counsel on that question to make sure we're using the right verbiage and terms if we're inserting such language in a master deed. But absolutely, it's the goal of the city that the property owner, the HOA, the condo association is responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of a sidewalk. For obvious reasons, it would not be sustainable for us to absorb that into either a general fund or any of our restricted funds.
And actually, that might be a good solution in the event that the developer does not want to build the bridge, that the responsibility for a bridge would be the responsibility of that phase homeowners.
Very similar to Mr. Beardsley, to the reference that Mr. Gearbaugh just made about the Huntington Wood connecting sidewalk. That agreement is written in such a way that that maintenance and upkeep and replacement is the burden of Huntington Woods, not the city of Saline.
I'd be happy to check with legal counsel on the language for that.
thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from the Planning Commission members? Nope. All right. Is there a motion to approve, not approve, or approve with conditions?
I'll move to approve with conditions, but I'd just like to add a recommendation that the city council consider the sidewalk be placed on the west side of Maple. And any additional information related to the legal review of the potential bridge that's required.
I'll second that. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Discussion items? Nothing?
Thank you.
Is there a motion on the table to excuse the absences?
Can I real quick, I apologize, this is for Danica. I missed this when we approved the minutes from the March 22nd meeting, so I'm assuming this change can be made without objection. But in the motion, moved by Beardsley, seconded by Troika, to recommend an ordinance regarding accessory dwelling units, the ayes should read Beardsley, Carroll, Fosdick, Heft, Troika, Young, and myself.
Yes.
Yep.
I can make that change.
Thank you. And then I'll move to excuse the absences of Commissioners Fosdick and Staff Rep Cole.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Would anybody like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting at 7:54 PM? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Board